Pleasure. Are we ready to
Well,
go ahead and
we,
begin?
we are ready to start.
Perfect. Welcome. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for being here this evening. I really appreciate you all taking the time out to spend an evening with me and learn a little bit about deep space astrophotography. Just to give you a very brief background or introduction, my name is Temu. Last name is Nana, Nana. I'm originally from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I have been mostly on the East Coast for the last 20 years, a little bit of New York, Philly. I was in Utah for a couple of years as well. Um, but the sort of the largest portion of that time, I've actually been traveling pretty much full time for work. So when I'm not doing things like this, teaching astrophotography or doing astrophotography, I actually lead photo trips for a small company. We take small groups of photographers all over the world. And I do sort of one-off educational travel stuff as well. So for the better part of 15 years, I was just on the road permanently. I didn't really have a home. I now have a wife and child and live in southwestern New Hampshire. So that's where I am for the time being. And I am still on the road, maybe 4 months or so out of the year, give or take. Although, of course, with COVID, that sort of stopped things up a little bit. Now, my career in astrophotography or my passion for astrophotography, my passion for the night sky started when I picked up a camera in the very, very beginning. I have always loved the nighttime, the night sky. I'm a night owl. And so right from the very beginning, I was interested in night photography. Picked up a tripod almost immediately after getting my first camera. But I really took my first like real deep dive into astrophotography about 4 years ago now. So it was just pre-pandemic, and I really caught an incredible wave because in the last 5 years, backyard astrophotography has come so far that what people are able to do now, even in the last 5 years compared to 5 years ago, is just incredible. And compared to 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, it is night and day. We are able to get things just from our backyard with relatively simple equipment that was just never possible before. And that's due to developments in processing and cameras and sensors and all the rest of it. So I'm thrilled to be able to share this with you in the hopes that it will spark some of you to maybe try this out, to give it a shot and see if it's something that you enjoy doing, or maybe just to appreciate pretty photos and have a better understanding of how these images are made. So before we jump in, and we're going to jump in right now because we got a lot to cover. Let me just say that I don't expect everyone to retain all of this information. We're going to be going through quite a lot, and I'll dive deep into some areas. But this is a really expansive area of photography, despite being a little niche area of it. There are a lot of different ways you can approach this, tons of different equipment. So I can't cover all of it. I can just kind of give you the basics. But I'm going to send out all of the slides that I show here tonight, the informational slides, not the images, but the ones with actual information on them. I'm going to send those all out as a PDF. So if you're interested in getting those, I'm going to work with Eileen and we can make sure that we get those to you, whether we follow up with you afterward or if you need to contact me, we'll sort that out. I think we can follow up with you afterward and I can send that out. So that's one thing. Second thing I want to say is my email address will be included in that follow up or in that outreach. And if you have any questions, if you're just starting out, you're just not sure what you want to do, hey, here's my budget, here's what I'm thinking. I'm happy to help you with that. So please do reach out. I'm happy to sort of get you started and give you some advice if that's what you're looking for. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. So I started my astrophotography with sort of basic nightscapes like you're seeing here, right? These are hopefully well exposed, well focused shots at night. Now, some of these obviously are obvious night photos. Part of the reason that I like shooting at night is you're never sure what you're going to get. When you expose for a long time, even with clouds, even with inclement weather, you can get some really cool stuff. So I started out playing with all that stuff, just doing basic sort of night photos and figuring out how to balance exposures, that sort of thing. I moved into sort of single shot lunar astrophotography. So doing just long lenses with moons, single shot, pretty high shutter speed. And from there, I really fell in love with star trail images. Now, these are images that are shot over the course of several hours, and they show the movement of the stars over that period of time. So these are composite images. You'll shoot a foreground and you'll shoot hours of the background and use either dedicated programs or something like Photoshop to combine them. They're actually quite simple to do. They're scientifically interesting because they're showing you sort of the celestial pole in many cases, or at least the path, the apparent motion of the stars over the course of several hours. And they're eye-catching. And so they were a lot of fun to do. They're pretty straightforward and easy to do. You set up the camera to just start shooting. You can go have a drink or relax for a couple hours, and you come back and the camera's been buzzing away. And it's a nice way to sort of do something that's quite interesting. From there, I moved into single shot Milky Way images. So these are, again, obviously just single images, not multiple stacked images. You generally need pretty dark sky for stuff like this. This kind of astrophotography, Milky Way stuff, is pretty difficult to do from, if not impossible to do, from really light polluted areas. You really need to get out at least somewhere that is a little bit rural in order to do that. And then from there, I started seeing, of course, all the Milky Way images that you see on major sites. And a lot of those are stacked images, which means, of course, they're taking multiple images of the Milky Way, normally using a star tracker, which is all stuff we're going to talk about. And then combining all those to get a deeper, richer, fuller color scheme, better dynamic range, more information to work with, and then combining that with a foreground as well, so that you are shooting the sky separately from the foreground, and you can combine those together. And as you can see here, the wonderful part about that, whether or not you like super colorful, overdone images like this, is that at least it gives you the opportunity. So by stacking and tracking those, you have much more information to play with, and you can really sort of let your artistic side come out a little bit. Now, all the images that you saw just there were shot with a basic stock Canon and a stock lens. In this case, most of those images were shot with a 16-35, the lunar images being the only exception. Those were shot with long lenses, I think a 100-400 or something of that nature. So everything you saw there, pretty basic. This is stuff that most people would have apart from the star tracker, which we will talk about. So you don't need crazy equipment to get some of the images that we just saw there. So again, one of the barriers, I think people think they need all sorts of crazy equipment for this. You can go that route, and I have gone that route, but you don't necessarily have to. You can do this with relatively straightforward stuff. Now, from that first sort of jumping off with Milky Way into stacking and doing tracked images where you're shooting an area of the sky for a lengthy period of time, I started doing some of these basic but true deep space images. So these are with longer focal length lenses, shooting for hours at a time. So you may be shooting for an hour or 2 hours or 9 hours or 10 hours over the course of several nights, combining all that information together. And again, these are all done with stock cameras, nothing special, and more or less regular lenses. They are, in some cases, very small telescopes, but the cost and the design, the cost is very similar or less than what you would see for similar zoom lenses. The design is that of a telescope, so it's made specifically for night photography. But again, the cost is very similar in the 600, 700, 800 range for a really very, very good piece of equipment. So again, we have not ventured into telescopes and that sort of thing quite yet. This is all stuff that can be done relatively straightforwardly with the equipment that most of you already have. So these are, what we're seeing here are various nebula. Some of them you might recognize, like the Pleiades star cluster here. Orion, we saw some dust clouds out of Cepheus and Ursa Major. So these are all things that are up there, of course, that are just generally very hard to see. Now, this is, I shot most of those with a setup that looks similar to this. This all looks rather confusing, but frankly, this is simply a star tracker with a geared head, not a pan tilt or a ball head on it, with a stock Canon camera, a very small telescope, which is a 250 millimeter telescope there, and then an intervalometer on the top. So again, it looks quite complicated, but really quite straightforward there. And then finally, we get into the telescopes area. So I have a 4-inch refractor that I can shoot from home. I also have access to a remote scope, which I'm able to do even more detailed imaging. But these were all done from my backyard with 4-inch refractors. And these are emission nebula, reflection nebula, dark nebula, galaxies, all anywhere from 1,000 light years away to 30 million light years away, and shot anywhere between maybe 1 hour, 2 hours total. Some of them up to 30, 35, or 40 hours that I would have spent over the course of several weeks. Now, I'm going to talk very briefly about this, but most of these are shot with a mono camera with different filters in front of them. So you can shoot deep space astro in color, but it restricts you in some ways. You can shoot it with mono cameras with different filters in front of it. It gives you much more flexibility, particularly if you're shooting from light polluted areas. And these are all shot differently depending on what the object is. So comets, star clusters, galaxies all need to be shot with regular true color RGB, red, green, and blue filters. Whereas things like emission nebula need to be shot with narrowband filters. I'm not going to go into the details of all of that just because it gets a little off into the weeds. But the point is that you're going to see a lot of images tonight that will be in mono. And you might think to yourself, but the final image looks like it's in color and it looks like you're shooting these in mono. I am. I normally shoot in mono and then I shoot with a series of filters, which I can then combine into a color image towards the end. So all of those images that you just saw there were taken with this little setup that I have. I have since changed it a little bit, but it's a pretty simple 4-inch refractor on a computerized motorized mount. So I, through a computer, an actual laptop, I can tell the mount where to point the telescope, how often to shoot, what to shoot for how long, and so on and so forth. It's basically, once I set it up, an automated procedure that I can simply oversee, and it shoots throughout the night. So it's nice because I can set it up to shoot and I can go to bed for a few hours and come back while it's done all the work. Now, finally, as I mentioned, I'm very fortunate through a very generous friend of mine to have access to this remote telescope in California. It's a 14-inch, well, there's two telescopes, a 4-inch and a 14-inch scope. It is in a observatory with a retractable roof that you can see. This time lapse just shows you, opens up at night. I can program it from anywhere in the world as long as I have an internet connection to shoot whatever I want to. And it then sends me the data in the morning. It is an incredibly luxurious toy to be able to play with, as I said, and it's made me very lazy as an astrophotographer because I can do this instead of going out and being out there all night by myself. But through a scope like that, I'm able to get some of the more detailed images that you'll see here, objects that are a little bit farther away. Again, shooting with that same system of a mono camera with different types of filters in front of them. Some of them narrowband, some of them broadband, and able to capture these little glimpses of the galaxy that I believe we're just incredibly privileged to be able to see. We can see more now just from our backyards than scientists and governments were able to even 40, 50 years ago. And of course, with telescopes like Hubble and now James Webb coming online, we're able to see even more and learn more than we ever knew possible or thought possible. So it's an exciting time to be in astrophotography, to understand a little bit about what we're seeing, and to be able to image these things from your backyard. Pretty incredible stuff. So we're going to talk about all that stuff. We're going to see a few more images here as well, of course, but I just wanted to give you an idea of sort of the things that I shoot and how I shoot them and what equipment I'm shooting them with. So a little bit of a tour through our night sky there. We saw all sorts of things. Now, these are all northern hemisphere objects. I have not had the opportunity to shoot in the southern hemisphere, at least not very much, but they have a whole nother collection, in fact, a much better collection of deep space objects in many ways in the southern hemisphere that we're not going to see here tonight. Now, the last thing that I will mention is that you may have noticed that I do not do any planetary imaging. Planetary imaging is done with wildly different equipment and done in a completely different way than deep space imaging. And that's for any number of reasons. the relatively small size of the planets as compared to some of these objects, which are many solar systems wide. Even though they are farther away than the planets are, they appear much bigger in the sky. And part of it is because of the movements of the planet and the way that they rotate so quickly. You can't do long exposures for hours on end. In fact, most of it is done by video, taking high-speed video, isolating the best frames out of that video, and that's how they produce planetary images. But you won't see any planetary images tonight because it's just not something I do. It's just a wildly different type of astrophotography. Hopefully in a year I can come back and give you a little bit of a brush up on that, as I'm hoping to get into that very shortly. So here's what we are going to cover this evening. I want to talk a little bit about deep space imaging theory, the theory behind deep space imaging, how and why we do what we do. Generally, this is known as image stacking. So we're going to talk a little bit about image stacking. We'll talk about equipment requirements. We'll talk about using the equipment, and that is really sort of geared in on the star tracker. And then we're going to talk about some post-processing workflows and the software used. And then I'm going to make some suggestions, things that if you were going to be taking the first couple steps in, what do I think you should invest in, or where should you look? What should you be thinking about? So let's talk a little bit about deep space imaging theory, otherwise known as image stacking. Now, you may be familiar with this, but for those who are not, let's answer a couple questions. What is image stacking, and why do we have to use image stacking? Number one, image stacking is the process of combining dozens or hundreds of images of an object in order to increase the signal to noise ratio. Now, I went to school for theater. When I hear phrases like signal to noise ratio, my brain actually starts melting out of my ear a little bit, but it's a fairly simple concept, essentially. The signal is the light from the object. It's the thing that you are trying to gather, whether it's the galaxy or nebula or comet or whatever it happens to be, and the surrounding stars, the good stuff. That's what you want. You want to boost that as much as possible. And the noise, as most photographers are aware of, are the artifacts, in this case in astrophotography, artifacts, cosmic ray, both fixed pattern noise and random noise that kind of gunks up your image, things that you really don't want in there. And by image stacking, we can increase the good stuff and we can decrease the bad stuff. And I can show you some pretty clear examples here. So this is a single 10-minute exposure on a nebula called the Tulip Nebula. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of grain. There's a lot of heat noise there. There's not a whole lot of dynamic range. It's quite light. You just don't see much there. Now, here is 30 of those 10-minute images. I have done no exposure change. I have done nothing in terms of actual editing on this. All I've done is take 30 of those 10-minute images and stacked them using a computer program, one on top of the other. And you can see the difference. It's quite clear if you put them side to side here. You can see the total exposure of 10 minutes on the left and the total exposure of almost 5 hours on the right. Now, if you dig in and go a little closer into the detail, you'll also notice that the noise has been significantly reduced. You have obviously much more detailed dynamic range, and you're able to do much, much more with that image. So it's a comparison between 10 minutes of exposure and nearly 5 hours of exposure. Now, you can keep adding exposure and get more and more and more and more detail. There does come a point at which, you know, it doesn't really make sense to do more. But generally speaking, you're going to want to shoot for at least a few hours on most relatively bright targets. And once you combine all of the different things that you have shot over the course of several nights, you can come up with a final image, something like this. Now, as I said, those initial images that you saw, the single images, the stacked images shot in mono, but this color images, this final color images was created by shooting 3 different filters of mono. So you're getting 3 separate types of light information and combining them into a color image like you see here. So I'll give you an example. That was shot with a telescope, but these are from just a regular stock camera. Same principle applies. This is a region of Ursa Major with several galaxies in it, notably Messier 81 and 82. You can see them there just center left, those 2 little smudges. This is a single 3-minute exposure. You can see that there's really not much there. But if I take 180 of those exposures, this is almost 9 hours, and put them together, you can start to see that there is quite a lot of information there, including this lovely dust that you see, that sort of dust cloud in the center top left. And of course, the galaxies have become far more prominent. Now, at this stage, I like to think of it at this stage as sort of the stage at which a normal daytime photographer has just taken a photo and they're taking the photo out of their camera and putting it into Lightroom. That's what this stage is. But we already have to go through significant processing just to get it to this stage. So from here, you put it into image editing software like Lightroom or GIMP or Photoshop, bring out all those colors that are there, and then you end with a final image, something that looks maybe a little bit like this. Okay. So again, I'm just trying to show sort of the process of going from the single image towards the final image and what the power of image stacking, what it can actually do, what it can show you, because the single image doesn't look like a ton, right? Here's another example of a single 3-minute image of the Dark Shark Nebula. You don't see anything there. This is coming straight out of the camera. You don't see anything. But again, if you stack 60 of those 3-minute images, so now we have 3 hours worth of data. There you can see all of a sudden stuff is coming out. And then with more editing through Photoshop, you have a relatively clear final image. So again, just to give you that idea of the power of image stacking, that's how we are able to shoot really dim, very faint objects that are very, very far away, is through this particular procedure. Now, it doesn't just work with deep space objects. Of course, it also works with the Milky Way. And the great thing about the Milky Way is because it is so much more relatively bright and larger, you don't need to shoot for quite as long. So here's a single 90-second image of the Milky Way. This was shot with an astro-modified camera. And so it has an overwhelmingly red tint. Now, as you see here, here are 10 of those 90-second images. I've removed the red tint, so I've color corrected that a little bit. And although it's difficult to see, with this combined 10 images, you have much more depth, much more detail, much more color to pull out. And here is the final Milky Way image. Now, as it happens, like in most Milky Way images, when you're shooting this final Milky Way image, you also need to shoot a foreground. So you shoot the foreground and then composite that into a final image. So that stacking technique can be used both for deep space objects and for Milky Way objects, and for the Milky Way to do Milky Way images, just like you see here. This is another stacked image here and another stacked image as well. Now, if you want to be I don't want to say cheating, right? The idea is that you are shooting the Milky Way and the foreground in the same place at the same time, so that you can plausibly say, even though this is a composite image, this is what the sky looked like in this location at this time. It's not really fair game to shoot one Milky Way from 3 months ago from a different location and pop it behind another background that you may have, or a foreground that you may have shot. But you know what? It's your image. It's your photography. You do what you like with it. General sort of etiquette with night sky photographers, at least amongst astrophotographers, is to shoot your composite images same place at the same time. So now that we know what image stacking is, the answer or the question, why must we use it, should be pretty obvious, right? Astrophotography, like all other kinds of photography, is a matter of gathering light, how we gather that light and what we do with it. Well, the images that we are trying to produce are trying to gather light from targets that are very faint and very, very far away. And in order to get enough light to properly image that target, we need to shoot for hours on end in many cases. Perhaps with the Milky Way, not hours, minutes. But for most deep space objects, hours and hours. For very faint ones, like I said, you may do 30 or 40 hours worth of imaging. For brighter ones like Andromeda or the Pleiades or something of that nature, you could get away with just a couple. But the point is, you need to shoot for a long time and stack all those images together. So pretty straightforward. We just need to take lots and lots of photos and stack them. That's it, right? Of course not. It's not quite that easy, because nothing ever is. And what fun would it be if it was that easy? We, of course, have to remember that the night sky, at least to us, is appearing to move. Of course, it's the Earth that is actually rotating, but the night sky appears to move, which means that those objects that we want to shoot for 5 hours or 9 hours or 30 hours are moving not only throughout the night, But again, if we want to come back to that object the next night, we have to have a way to both find it and to track it. Most importantly, to track it. Because if we want to shoot 1 minute or 3 minute or 5 minute exposures and we want to shoot them for hours, we need to have something that's going to move our camera in time with the stars in order to be able to take those long exposure photographies, those long exposure images, so that we don't have trailing, where you have the image, just the night sky moving through the image. You'll end up with star trail images, which in this case is not what we want. We want pinpoint stars over the course of several minutes. Okay, so with that in mind, let's talk about some of the equipment requirements. Now, we're going to talk about some basic stuff: star trackers, cameras, lenses, the whole 9 yards. But really, truthfully, the basic equipment that we're talking about, you can just scale it up, and it is the same thing all the way throughout, up to, not including the James Webb, right? Because they're out in space. It's a pretty different thing. But almost all Earth-based space imaging equipment follows the same pattern. You're going to have some sort of a sensor, a camera. You need some sort of a lens, whether it's a camera lens or a telescope, and you need something, a motorized mount of some sort, in order to track the objects. The only difference is how complicated each of those things becomes. So same basic idea all the way through. So let's talk about basic equipment requirements here. First of all, of course, you're going to need a camera, one that can be put into full manual mode. Could be a DSLR, could be a mirrorless, it could be an Astro Cam, a specifically built Astro camera, which we'll talk very briefly about as well. You want a lens that can be focused manually. It could be a wide angle or a zoom. It really depends on what you're shooting, right? So for Milky Ways, either single shot or the tracked Milky Ways, you're probably looking at somewhere between 40 and 20 millimeters, maybe 25 millimeters. Whereas something like the Pleiades or Andromeda, that's a little bit more of a deep space target, a true deep space target, you're going to want lenses that are in the 100 to 400, 200 and above, somewhere around there. So it really kind of depends on what you want to shoot, obviously. You're going to need a tripod with a head. I would err on the side of having a sturdy tripod. I know a lot of people like to use those lightweight travel tripods. You really need balance here, because you are putting some heavier pieces of equipment on top, and you're asking them to be steady as they are moving. So having a sturdy tripod is very important. A ball or a geared head is best. I'm not a big fan of the pan and tilt heads, but any head will work in a pinch, as long as it can be tightened down nice and tight and you can make sure that it's sturdy. You're going to need a headlamp, and preferably one with red light options so that it doesn't destroy your night vision. A really important piece of equipment. You don't want to be fooling with your camera, phone, flashlight, and all the rest of it. Keep it hands-free, keep it on your head, and have a red light option so that you can get used to working without destroying your night vision. And then finally, in most cases, you're going to need an intervalometer. Now, this is something that controls your camera. It will, it tells the camera how long to expose for, how many shots to take, and the interval in between the shots, hence the term intervalometer. Now, some of these are built into cameras. Most cameras, new cameras in particular, have them built in. However, I do prefer the external ones. They tend to be far more flexible into what you can do with them. So those are really the required pieces of equipment that we're going to talk about. Of course, you see them all here, pretty straightforward. This is what I captured. A lot of those images that you saw were captured with just this basic equipment here. So nothing too crazy. Again, the only thing that you might not have here in your kit is the intervalometer, which I will suggest the one that I have used and loved for years towards the end of the program there. The only other thing that you are going to need, of course, besides this sort of standard equipment that most folks are going to have, is, of course, the star tracker. Otherwise known, or officially known, as a motorized mount. The star tracker is the object that you see here sitting on top of the tripod. I also have the exact one right here in my hand, so you can get sort of an idea of the size of it. It is a somewhat chunky piece of equipment, but nothing too big. You can see it there on the right, sitting in between the tripod and the camera itself. Now, there are two very popular models: the Skywatcher Star Adventure, which is the one that I have here, and the Ioptron Sky Guider Pro. They are both ubiquitous. I mean, they're the two leading ones. They're both really good models to start with and to grow into. And you'll notice that both of them actually come really in about two pieces. So there's the motor tracker, which is this part up at the top here. And then down here, there's the wedge. And this is the part where you actually set the latitude. So whatever latitude you're at, that's set right here on the wedge. You need both of these in order to make a star tracker work. So if you do order them, just make sure that, of course, you are getting both of those things. And I'll again suggest that towards the end. A lot of them come with counterweight bars, which is really handy for when you want to put heavier equipment onto your tracker. And these trackers, while not the most accurate trackers in the world, are really quite good and can do quite a lot of stuff. Now, the trackers work in the same way that any other equatorial tracking mount works, which is essentially that you have to align the center of the tracker, and we're going to talk briefly about how to do that. There's a little polar scope in here that you can see. You have to align the center of this tracker with the celestial pole, otherwise known as Polaris or the North Star. It's not exactly the celestial pole, but it's close enough. So we use that for reference. Once that is aligned, then you can point your camera in any direction, and it doesn't matter. The tracker will move the camera in time with the stars, and then you can begin your tracked and stacked imaging. All right. So that's what the trackers are about. We'll get back to them because we're going to talk about how to use them in just one moment. I want to go through a pretty simple how-to just for those that may be curious of starting or just kind of curious as to how it works. But while we're talking about equipment, a couple other things that you may not think but are very, very handy here as well. Take advantage of the technology that we have. If you are planning to do any deep space imaging, whether or not it is Milky Way or deep space objects, you're going to need to know what the weather is going to be like, including what the clouds are going to be like. It might be a very nice evening, but if it's intermittent clouds coming through, it's probably not going to be a great evening to shoot. Some of these apps that you see here, the weather with sky and cloud, clear outside, ICSC, which is clear sky chart, and Astrospheric are all great resources to sort of tell you what the skies are going to look like. And then there are planetarium apps like Stellarium, Sky Safari Pro, several other ones as well, photo pills, that will tell you where in the sky certain things are. So if you're looking for an object, you can hold up your phone and it will show you where it is. You can type it in and it will zoom over to the part of the sky. Those are really handy. So take advantage of the technology that we have in the palm of our hands. An example here of Sky Safari Pro on the left-hand side. This app, as a matter of fact, with some telescopes, you can actually connect it to your telescope and control your entire telescope through that app. I use it for locating certain objects so that if I'm trying to star hop and go from one location to another, that's basically how I use Sky Safari. Photo pills is something that a lot of people are very familiar with, not just for night sky, but for general sort of photo planning. And what I love so much about photo pills is that it has an augmented reality, which means that you can essentially put your phone up, turn the camera on, and you will see during the daytime, for instance, that this photo that you see on the right is a screenshot of my house in Utah. And I wanted to see that little orange dot is the center of the Milky Way. And I wanted to see, okay, tonight at 9:07 p.m., what is the Milky Way going to look like? And so you can just hold your phone up, and no matter where you move your phone, the Milky Way will move within it. So you can say, okay, great. The Milky Way is going to be right here at this time, from this time to this time, and at this height. It's a really great planning tool. So use those tools to your advantage. The last thing, of course, that you are going to want to do, or maybe the first thing that you're going to want to do, is to find out where you have the darkest skies close to you. There are several places where you can do this. Dark Site Finder is one. I prefer lightpollutionmap.info. They give you pretty good readings as to where the light pollution is around you so that you can try to escape it to get better skies to shoot. So that's some of the equipment, speaking very basically, just to get started as you're moving into this. That's some of the equipment that you really might want to think about. Again, you're going to have most of this already. The only thing that you might need to add to your kit is that intervalometer and that star tracker. All right. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about actually using the equipment. And here we're going to go a little bit into detail with the star tracker, but I just wanted to familiarize people with it. So if you're thinking about doing it, I think it intimidates people quite a lot, and it's really not that difficult. So let's go through step by step as to how one might do this. So you're going to take your tripod and your tracker, and you're going to set up the tracker on top of the tripod. Of course, there's a base here, screws right into the tripod at the bottom. And you're going to set it up so that the front of the tracker here is facing due north. You can use your phone's compass to do this, or you can just eyeball it. It doesn't have to be perfect right now. It just has to be facing due north. You're going to want to make sure that the tripod is balanced so that it's not wobbly, so that it's a nice level surface. And you're going to want to set the latitude that from which you're shooting on the tracker. Now, as you can see here, if I move this forward, there's a little sort of graduated sort of degree base there. And I can loosen this little knob on the side here, and I can rotate this and move that arrow sort of up or down to match the latitude where I am. So I'm roughly at 42 degrees. So that's where my latitude is. If I was shooting from 50, I would adjust this so that it hit 50 on the little bar there. So just a quick, easy thing. Normally you're shooting from the same place every night. So once you do that once, you don't have to change it every night. The next thing you need to do is locate Polaris, AKA the North Star, and make sure that you can see it in the polar scope. Now, this little eyepiece that you see here is a polar scope, and it's actually running right through and comes out the front of this of the tracker. And you want to make sure that after you pointed north, you can bend down and you're looking through that polar scope, and you just want to make sure that you can see Polaris there. It doesn't have to be perfectly center. It just needs to be there. And that way you know that you're pretty close. Okay. Now, let me show you how to find Polaris, because for some people that's going to be really difficult, but there's a really easy way to do it. From where almost all of us are in the Northern Hemisphere here, we have a pretty good view of the Big Dipper almost every single night of the year. If you go from the bottom 2 stars of the Big Dipper and you follow them from the bottom star out through the top star and draw pretty much a straight line, the next major star that you come to is Polaris. It is not the brightest star in the sky, contrary to popular belief. It's not even close to the brightest star in the sky. But if you can see the Big Dipper, follow from the bottom of the bowl out through the top star of the bowl, it is very clear that the next brightest star that you see is Polaris. That also happens to be the tail of the Little Dipper, or Ursa Minor. So that's the easiest way to find Polaris. Keep in mind that the position of Polaris itself doesn't change. Once you found it, it will be more or less in the same position for the rest of our lifetimes and for several lifetimes, many lifetimes after that. However, the Big Dipper will change position relative to Polaris, not only throughout the seasons, but throughout the night as well. So if you come out at 9 o'clock, the Big Dipper may be on top, pointed down. If you come out at 2 a.m. that night, the Big Dipper may be on the side, pointed towards it. So just keep in mind that the Big Dipper location will change, but the North Star Polaris, that won't be changing for many thousands of years. So you don't need to worry about that. So once we have located Polaris, the next step we need to do is to, again, turn to our technology. We can use our mobile apps to learn what position Polaris needs to be in within the polar scope. Now, I'm going to explain all this because I know it probably sounds a little bit confusing. When you look through the polar scope, I don't know if I can get this up close enough for you to be able to see there. You can actually see a little reticle. I don't know if you guys can see it there. Just barely, you can probably see it in there. There's like a little bullseye, basically, right inside the polar scope. And you might think to yourself, okay, what I need to do is put Polaris dead center of those crosshairs. It's actually not true. Polaris is not exactly on the celestial pole, and that's what we need to put right in the center of those crosshairs is the celestial pole. So what we need to do is put Polaris somewhere on that circle that says 0369. You can see those little numbers there. And what we do is we turn to our technology by using any number of apps where you open it up when you go out to shoot, you open up your app, and it figures out where you are in the world. You don't need to be connected to anything. It just uses GPS. It knows the time and the location, and it tells you, okay, in this instance, you need to have Polaris right there, that little black dot that you see on that circle. That's where you need to put Polaris when you look through your polar scope. So in this case, it looks like it's at about the 930 position, somewhere around there. And when we go back to our polar scope now, we are going to adjust Polaris using these knobs, the up and down knob here and left and right. So azimuth and altitude. you're going to use these knobs to adjust the position of Polaris inside the polar scope. So you're actually adjusting the star tracker just a little bit until Polaris is in that location that the app told you it should be, right there, that 9:30 or 10 o'clock location. So it's pretty straightforward, actually. Once you have that, as I said, while looking through the polar scope, you use the knobs to adjust the star tracker, put Polaris in the correct position. And then all you have to do is attach your camera right here to the top. So I would then slide my camera right into that base there. My camera is sitting on top of the tripod right here, and I can point my camera in any direction, focus it up, and we're ready to start shooting. Of course, you have to remember to also turn your star tracker on. Otherwise, of course, it's not going to be working very well for you. So that's basically how the trackers work. And that took me, what, 5 minutes to probably explain. Once you've done it maybe 5 times, it will take you 60 seconds, 80 seconds, somewhere around there. Really straightforward and easy. The key is once you have the tracker in place, you want to make sure you don't jog it or jostle it so that it stays nice and aligned. So the star tracker is the newest piece of information that I think will be somewhat challenging or daunting for folks who may be thinking they want to dip their toe into this, but really it's not terribly difficult. Let's talk really briefly about camera settings. And these, of course, are going to change. Your exposure settings are going to change based on a number of things, but there are some non-exposure settings that we can talk about that are pretty standard. Your camera, you're going to want to be in bulb or manual mode, whatever mode allows you to use your intervalometer. Depending on the camera system, that can change. You're going to want a single shot drive mode so that you're not shooting continuous, where you press down the shutter and it shoots a bunch of shots. You just want to take one at a time. So single shot drive modes. Your white balance can be auto. You don't need to have any special white balance. It may not look perfect, but you're going to be doing a lot of post-processing anyway. You can use custom or a K value if you want, but I just leave it on auto and change it afterwards. Your file format must be RAW. You should not be shooting in JPEG. You really want to be shooting in a RAW format here because you want to get as much out of that image as you possibly can. You want to turn off your image stabilization because you are shooting already on a stable platform. And so if you try to use image stabilization and there is nothing to stabilize, sometimes that can actually introduce defects. So you want to turn off image stabilization. You want to turn off noise reduction. This is something that a lot of cameras have. I won't go into it, but essentially it halves your battery life and doubles the exposure time. It's not something you need. The whole point of stacking is to reduce noise. So we're already taking care of that by shooting a lot of images. So you don't need that noise reduction. Insofar as the exposure settings that you will actually do in your camera, remember, exposure length, which is normally done in camera, will be set in the intervalometer. So the only things that you're setting in the camera are the ISO and the aperture. The ISO is always going to be variable. It should probably be between 800 and 1600, just as a starting point. And your aperture should be wide open. Whatever the widest that your lens allows you to be, that's where you should be. Now, once you get a little bit of experience, you might want to stop it to one above where the maximum is. You're generally going to get a little bit better performance, but when you're beginning, you just want it to have as wide open as possible, let as much light in as you can. Now let's talk really briefly about the intervalometer settings. The intervalometer, you're going to set the exposure length. You are going to set the number of images, and you're going to set the interval between those images. And all these things are going to depend on a number of things. The exposure length will depend on the accuracy of your tracker. Some trackers can track accurately for up to 5 minutes. Some can only do 2 minutes. Some, it depends on how much equipment. Is it bigger, heavier equipment? It's not going to be quite as accurate. Is the focal length longer? You need much more accurate tracking to keep longer focal lengths perfectly in line. So it's going to depend on a number of things. Generally, you're going to be between 30 seconds and 3 minutes, somewhere around there. The number of images will depend on your target's brightness. If it's a super bright target like Pleiades or Andromeda or the Milky Way, you don't need as much. If it's a much dimmer target, you're going to need a lot more images because you need to expose for much longer. The target's position, maybe it's low in the sky and it only reaches a certain height in your sky, so you can't shoot for a long period of time. Maybe there's weather coming in later that night, so you can only shoot for 2 hours or 3 hours. All these things are going to affect the number of images that you want to shoot. And of course, the length of your exposures will also determine if you the number of images you want to shoot. If, for example, you want to shoot 2 hours of Andromeda and you're shooting 1 minute, individual images, you're going to need 120 of those images. If you're shooting 2 minutes, you're only going to need 60 of those images, right? So it depends on the length of the individual exposures. And then the interval between the images, that really, you want it as quick as possible, maximize the amount of time that you have, but it's really going to depend on your camera and the card, the memory card, the speed of the memory card, because the camera needs time to take that image that it just took, take it off of the sensor, put it onto the memory card, and reset everything and get ready for the next photo. Generally speaking, it's going to be between 5 and 7 seconds, depending on your camera. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about focusing methods. I'm not going to go through full focusing, but this is something that people find really challenging. Let me see if I have, yes, I do have my mask here. There's a couple different methods to use. If you are shooting the Milky Way with something widescreen or even with deep space, with a longer focal length, what you can do is simply turn on your LCD screen in the back of your camera, use your digital zoom to zoom in on a star and make that star as big as possible in your LCD screen, and then use your manual focus to make the star as small and sharp as possible. And that's how most people do the focusing. You can focus on any star, and once you focused on that star, even if it's not one that's going to be in the frame that you're going to shoot, it doesn't matter. All the stars are equidistant as far as the camera is concerned. So focus on one bright star, get it in focus, and then you can recompose your shot. Now, the other option you have is something like this, which is called a Batonov mask. And Batonov masks are good for longer focal lengths. As you can see, the mask sort of has 3 different patterns that it does sort of 3 different angles, and it just sits on top of a lens. Let me see if I have my lens here. You just put it on top of a lens just like so. And what it does is it creates a diffraction pattern in the stars. So this is best viewed with really bright stars. And it gives you really, really accurate ways to focus, because you can see it creates this diffraction on the star. And as you can see on the left and the right images, if you are out of focus, that center diffraction spike will be to the left or to the right of the center of the image. Whereas when you are in focus, it is perfectly in the center, and now you know your focus is great. These are really handy for any focal lengths over about 100 millimeters. They don't work so well at wide angles, I'm afraid. So you're better served with the LCD screen. So now we've focused, we've got our tracker set up, we've got our camera settings, everything is gone. We're ready to start actually shooting. So let's start shooting, and then we have to review the images. But how do we know that we are actually getting decent images? The only way to be able to tell is by looking at the histogram. That's true of daytime photography. That's true of nighttime photography as well. So going back to an image that we saw earlier, this region of M81, M82, the 3-minute exposure, if you look at this histogram that you'll see here, if that was a daytime histogram, no way that's going to work. But for a nighttime histogram, particularly for a deep space histogram like this, that is perfectly fine. All that information should be in the last third or the last quarter. If it's up in the middle of the range, it's probably too bright. You're going to have the background sky is going to be too bright for you. So this is a really good histogram, even though the shot looks like there's nothing in it. When you stack, as I said, 100 of these together, you're going to find something there. So that's how you can tell if these images that you're shooting actually look good. Are they in focus? Yes, great. Are there star trails? No, everything looks pretty sharp. Okay. What does the histogram look like? All my information is in the last quarter, last third. That's perfect. That's great. That's what you need. If you're looking at a Milky Way image, of course, you're going to have something a little bit different because there's much more light. It's much brighter. So in this case, everything is still in that bottom third, but you can see there's much more information there. And that's fine. You're only going to be doing maybe 8, maybe 10, maybe 15 Milky Way images, not hundreds and hundreds of them. So you don't need to really worry about that. Okay, so we have successfully captured images. Yes, it is a great feeling. Sometimes it takes a while to finally get there, but you've got your images. Now what? Now is when it finally dawns on you that really capturing images is only half the battle. Processing is a big part of astrophotography, particularly deep space astrophotography. And there are 1,000 different ways to go about this. There's no way that I can dive into all the things that come into processing. You can learn a lot of this through YouTube. You can talk to people like me and we'll help you with all these things. But I want to share with you just what the basic sort of post-processing workflow looks like. We're going to dig into something that's specific to astrophotography and then finish up with some suggestions on equipment. So unlike normal, I would say normal daytime photography, where you take the photo, it comes out of the camera, it's already looking pretty good, you put it in Lightroom and you do a little image editing. There's an entire process that needs to happen with astrophotography before we even get to image editing, and that's the calibration and stacking. We haven't talked about calibration, but we will in just one moment. We have talked about stacking. So when you take your hundreds of images, you need to go through a calibration and stacking software, and there's different kinds, and then you need to go through image editing to get to the final image. So you have your individual images, again, from that M81, M82 region. You take 180 of those, you go put them through calibration and through stacking, and you have this calibrated and stacked image. And by the way, this is the same process that Hubble and James Webb and all of those telescopes, they all go through this process as well. And they're all shot in mono and then changed into color. So you have your individual images, you calibrate, you stack them, and you have a calibrated and stacked image. Now that's kind of what I think as what day photographers have coming right out of the camera. So we have to go through this whole process just to get to that point. And then from there, we take that calibrated and stacked image, we put it into some sort of image editing software like Lightroom or Photoshop or GIMP or any number of ones, and you come out with a finished image there. Okay. Now, when we are talking about both shooting and processing for Milky Way versus deep space, there are two different things. Even though this is stacked imaging, you can stack the Milky Way, you stack deep space object, but we have to think about them a little differently. And I'm just going to preface this all by saying I'm going to go off into the weeds here just a little bit, but I just want you to start thinking about all this. And remember, I'm happy to share all these slides with you so that you can have all this information and go over it at your leisure. So with Milky Way imaging, when you're doing stacked imaging like this, you're going to have fewer frames. It's going to be faster and simpler because you're not shooting for hours on end. You're only shooting for 30 or 40 minutes. However, you need to shoot a sky and probably a foreground. So you're going to need to shoot both of those things, and you have to blend them together in post-processing. So that is sort of a challenge of doing stacked Milky Way that you don't have in deep space. So you need to think about that and have those processing skills, or at least be willing to start learning them and to play with them a little bit. This last mention, you only have to shoot light frames. Light frames are what astrophotographer calls the frames of the actual object that you want to shoot. So the galaxy or the nebula or what have you. Those are called light frames. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, what other kind of frames are there besides those ones? We'll get to that in just one moment. In astrophotography, there are actually quite a few different frames that you're going to shoot. In deep space, you need more frames because you're shooting a much dimmer, more distant object. So you need many, many more frames to shoot. It's longer. It could take weeks even, depending on what you're shooting. It might take days. It could take several nights. And it's a little bit more complicated in the processing. However, you're only shooting the sky. You're not shooting a foreground object. So no blending is needed there. But the one thing that is really necessary for deep space imaging is something called calibration frames. Now, these are things that you don't really have to shoot with the Milky Way. You can shoot them, but they're not really necessary. With deep space imaging, they really make a big, big difference. And I'll tell you why. Calibration frames are stacked images. So these are images that we shoot many calibration frames, anywhere from 20 to 100 or 200 of them. We stack them together just like we do the light frames. And these calibration frames are stacked images used to correct fixed pattern noise, vignetting, and dust motes. I know that sounds complicated, but these are basically used to correct imperfections in the optical train. So you've got all these things happening, the camera, the lens, maybe you've got filters, you're shooting for long periods, so you've got heat noise. All this sort of stuff creates fixed pattern noise, and in some cases, random noise as well. But the calibration frames are really used to get that fixed pattern noise, isolate it, and remove it from the images. Because stacking will stack all of the good stuff. But if you have a lot of imperfections that are repeating in all of those frames, it's going to stack all the bad stuff too. So you need a way to get rid of that. So before you stack them, you have to calibrate them. And I'm going to throw a lot of information at you, but we're going to move through it quickly. And again, this is really just so that you can have an idea of it. There's three different types of calibration frames. Let me go back. You got biased, you have darks, and you have flats, okay? Bias frames look a little bit like this, and they simply correct for what's called read noise on the sensor. So when your camera puts an image on the sensor and then it removes it from the sensor and writes it over to the memory card, there are imperfections introduced during that process. This is called read noise. So to isolate that imperfection, we take these bias frames and they're taking at the highest possible shutter speed. They take it with no light entering the lens, and they're taking it various ISOs because they change depending on the ISO. So if you shoot astrophotography at 800 or 1600 or 3200, you have to take bias frames with all these different ISOs. The good part is that once you have them, they can be reused for months, if not years. So you don't have to do this every single night. You just set sort of a library of them and away you go. Practically, you shoot about 50 to 100 of these frames at about as fast the shutter speed as you can, 1/4000th or 1/8000th in a dark room, so there's no light coming in, and you do this for different ISOs. Now, what is it correct for? Here are the visuals that you can see. Do you see that big light band on the left-hand side of the image there? And again, up at the top, there's a very dark band there. Those are imperfections in the pixels and in the reading of the pixels that come out when you move something off the sensor. If you stack all of those together, you get some pretty nasty stuff. So you can see here on this individual image, over on the left-hand side, you can see that light bar on the left-hand side of the image, and up at the top, you can see that dark bar as well. Disregard the vignettes, that's taken care of. The corner vignette is taken care of by something else. Once we apply the bias, you can see that that goes away. So I'll go back there. Again, you can see the light and the dark at the top. We apply the bias frame, and now we have a nice clean frame that we can stack together. So those are bias frames. Let's talk briefly about dark frames. They correct for dark current, otherwise known as hot pixels or heat noise, and something called amp glow. So as the camera and the sensor get hotter and hotter, which they will over the course of the night because you are exposing for 3 or 5 minutes at a time for hours on end, there are white pixels, hot pixels, and heat noise that are introduced into your image. So in order to isolate those things, to be able to remove them, we take dark frames with no light entering the frame. They are taken at the same exposure length as any of our light frames with the same ISO and hopefully the same temperature, because again, this is about heat. So if I shoot 3 minutes at 60 degrees outside, there is X amount of heat noise that is introduced. But if it's 90 degrees outside, then there's much more heat noise. So you try to shoot them at similar temperatures. As I said, they're taken with no light entering the lens. And the good part is once you build a library of these, you can reuse them for months on end. So practically you shoot about 20 to 50 frames at various ISOs, exposure lengths, and temperatures. This is usually done outside at night, perhaps on a cloudy night. You just spend a few hours letting it 1 minute at 800 ISO, 1 minute at 1600 ISO, so on and so forth. And you just shoot a ton of these images. You build a library and you can reuse them. So it's a little bit of work up front, but you can reuse these for months, if not years. Now, let me show you what it fixes here. So this is dark current. So here you have the good stuff that you want, right? These are stars. You want to keep those guys. But what you don't want is all of this stuff, these hot pixels, this white noise. Doesn't look like much in a single image. But again, if you stack several hundred of those images together, they're going to create a problem. By applying the dark calibration frames, you just get rid of that and you have a nice clean image there. Finally, there's something called amp glow, which happens with CMOS cameras. So these are these kind of cameras, which are Astro dedicated cameras. They often have something called amp glow, which you can see is that big awful light on the right-hand side. Here it is isolated in a dark frame. And again, you have to isolate the problem and then remove it out. So once we have that, we go back to the image, we apply that dark frame, and there you go. we no longer have any sort of an amp glow over on the right-hand side. So dark frames are very, very important. Hard to see sometimes their difference or the difference they make, but they're quite important there. And finally, we have flat frames. These are the most obvious. They correct for vignetting, gradients, dust motes, and other filter defects. I don't want to get into detail to this. You have to match a certain brightness level. They're taken at the same ISO as your light frames, and you have to have even light entering the lens. So this is the only calibration frame where you actually have light entering the lens, because you want to mimic what the optical train is seeing. Unfortunately, because they are going to correct for things that can change easily, like dust motes that are moving around in your optical frame, they need to be shot every night. But the good news is they only take about 2 to 3 minutes or so at the end of every night. People normally take a tablet like an iPad or some sort of a light source. They put it on top of the lens or the camera, maybe spreading a t-shirt out to diffuse the light and keep it nice and even. You set your camera to aperture priority, put the exposure compensation to +1, and you just shoot about 20 of those frames. And pretty easy. And these are really easy to see how these fix things. You can see a very clear vignette up in the top corner. There's also smaller vignettes in all of the 4 corners. And you can see as well some dust motes that are there in the middle of the frame. Once you apply the flat frames, boom, all that stuff disappears and you are ready for stacking. So again, you go from the uncalibrated base frame or light frame that you have up at the top. You put calibration of the flat frame, bias frame, dark frame, and you come up with that top right image, a nice clean image that now you can stack several hundred of those together, and you will have a nice image to begin working in the image editing software. So calibration frames are not strictly necessary, but very helpful. They seem very daunting at first, but really they're quite easy. Bias and dark frames can be reused for months, if not years, and flats take roughly 1 to 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes at the end of every night to shoot. So although you do have to shoot them at the end of every night, they're really quite easy and straightforward. So that was the deepest dive that we're going to get off into the weeds. We're going to finish up here by talking about some stacking software, and then I'm going to suggest some things for you here. So for those that may not be aware of stacking software, if you're just doing Milky Way stacking, you can use programs like Starry Sky Stacker on Mac or Starry Landscape Stacker, or frankly, better programs on Windows called Deep Sky Stacker and Sequator. Now, these are primarily stacking only, so they don't really do much else besides doing the actual stacking. If you're doing deep space imaging, you're going to need something that can do calibration and stacking. And in this case, most people start with something called Siril, S-I-R-L, available for both Mac and Windows. It is a free program, which is really great, so that you can try that all out on your own for free. And then there are the gold standards of calibration, stacking, and in fact, these programs also do image editing as well, called PixInsight and AstroPixel Processor. They are going to run you $200 to $300. So before you get into that, you want to make sure that this is something that you actually really want to think about doing. The image editing software that most of us use are the standards that most people do, Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop, primarily Photoshop for the masking, but Lightroom with the new Lightroom actually has some pretty decent masking as well. And again, if you want full software that will do calibration, stacking, and the editing, PixInsight or AstroPixel Processor are really what you're going to look for, but those are going to be more expensive options for you. So finally, to end up, I know I've gone a little bit over last 10 minutes or so. Let's talk a little bit about some suggestions. What I think for those people who may be interested in doing this for themselves, kind of what you should look for. For cameras, again, DSLR or mirrorless, anything that you can put in full manual control, start with what you have. Don't go off and buy some crazy piece of equipment unless money is just no object for you. Start with what you have and see if this is something you may be interested in. All of the major camera brands have excellent low light models. The more you spend, generally speaking, the newer the camera, the better performance you're going to get. That being said, there are old models of cameras like the Canon 6D, from years ago that have legendary performance in astrophotography circles. So there are good ones that you can pick up relatively cheap that have really good low light performance as well. Or you can upgrade to a specialized camera. Now, when I say specialized cameras, there are your stock DSLRs or mirrorless cameras, which you can then astro modify, which makes them more attuned to the kind of light that a lot of deep space objects emit. So stock DSLRs tend to cut off a lot of light right at the edges of the visible spectrum. Unfortunately, a lot of things in space emit light at the very edge of the visible spectrum. So astromodifying your camera allows it to collect a little bit more of that light. You can get that done for about $400 on your camera. Or you could move from either a stock or astro modified DSLR into a cooled astro camera, something like this that you see here. These are basically just camera sensors with refrigerators built around them. They are sensitive to the kind of light that deep space objects produce, and they will cool themselves down to quite low temperatures, which means that the heat noise that you get off of these is much lower. You generally get improved images coming off these cooled astro cameras. They go from anywhere from $500 to $5,000 or more, depending on the size of the camera that you're going. But you can get a pretty good one for $1,000 or under. Now for lenses, again, it's going to depend on what you want to shoot, wide or zoom. You want to be in manual focus for sure. It's really going to depend on what kind of target you want to shoot, whether it's a wide angle Milky Way or something a little bit zoomed in like a Pleiades or Andromeda or something of that nature, Orion Nebula. Fast lenses are going to be best. So you want apertures at 1.8, f2, f2.8. Those are ideal for astrophotography. Now, some of the bigger scopes that you get have fixed apertures at f4.9 or 5 or f7. That's fine. Those scopes are built to image the same thing for hours on end. But if you're shooting with a lens, the faster the lens, the better. Generally speaking, again, the higher quality lens, the better performance you're going to get. However, there are some really small, excellent little telescopes, little guys like this, that cost similar or even cheaper than some zoom lenses. So let me tell you two lenses that I have that I really love. One of them is right here, which is the Rokinon or Samyang 135. It is a prime lens at f2. It costs somewhere around $500, something like that. So it's not a very expensive lens whatsoever. Tack sharp, you can use that Botanoff mask with something like this at 135. And it's a great focal range for a lot of different objects that you can get. The Hyades, Pleiades, you get the Horsehead Nebula along with Orion Nebula with a 135. There's a lot of stuff you can do with that focal length, which is really great. Tack sharp lens for not very much money. Another option is actually a small telescope, like one that you see here. This one is actually the same one that you're seeing there on the screen. It's the Williams Optics Red Cat 51. I got the gray version, which they call the Space Cat. You can see it looks kind of big, but actually this is just a lens hood. If I can take this off, you'll see that the actual lens itself is actually quite small. It's just that little guy there. It does work as a 250 millimeter prime lens at f4.9. It's about $800. They do have a version 2 of this lens now, and it's actually built as a small telescope. So with a Petzval design, it is built specifically for night photography, but it also functions as a regular 250 millimeter prime and tack sharp at that. So some really good options. And here are some images just to show you, again, what equipment I use to catch these images. So stock DSLR with a 135. Same thing here for, I think this is somewhere in Taurus here as well. Here's a wide angle of the Pleiades with a bunch of dust. Again, stock cameras and a 135. So a really standard setup. All you need is a star tracker and some darker skies, and you can get something like this. A stock DSLR with the Red Cat, that little mini telescope there as well. This one was the Astrocam along with the Red Cat. Again, Astrocam with the Red Cat. So again, these are just to give you an idea of what equipment I use to capture these photos. I have a couple left with astro modified DSLRs that give you a little bit more light than what the stock one does. And finally, let's shore up here by talking about intervalometers and star trackers. I highly recommend this intervalometer. It is a wireless intervalometer by a German company called Hanel or Hanel. It's called the Capture. It is without the E. They're about $80 to $100. I much prefer the wireless version. very flexible. It's a really great piece of kit. Also really good if you do any wildlife shooting, and you want to do sort of stuff getting close in on birds or animals, that kind of thing. Having that working as a remote shutter from 100 yards away is really great because you don't have to be there, and you can like fire off that trigger. Really handy. So some of the more popular star trackers, one called the Move Shoot Move, about $200. It's a great one for traveling. It's really only good for Milky Way. However, you don't have much room to grow with something like this, because it's just not hefty enough to handle bigger loads. So if you want something really small, light, and travel worthy, the Move Shoot Move is great, but you're really limited to doing tracked Milky Way shots. I mentioned these two before, the Ioptron Sky Guider Pro and the Skywatcher Star Adventure, anywhere between $200 and $500. They have different versions now, version 1, version 2. Most of them have mini versions, which have a smaller payload, as well as a bigger Pro version. I would really highly recommend the Pro versions, and I'll show you the kit that I got that I think is really very handy to have. And then there are really high-end star trackers as well, like the Fornax Light Track, which is a wildly different design, as you may be able to see here. And it's a little bit more expensive, but it can move a bigger payload much more accurately. So whereas with the Ioptron or the Star Adventure, you may, for let's say a 250 millimeter lens, you may be able to get 1 minute to 2 minutes of good tracking. With this, you may be able to get 3 to 5 minutes. So it allows you to take longer exposures, but of course, you have to pay a little bit more for something like that. I would highly recommend, if you were going to start, to do something like one of these kits. These are Star Tracker kits, which have extension bars, and they essentially allow you to grow. You can put heavier things on top of them. They come with the wedges, they come with the counterweight kits and counterweights, and everything you need to get going. So you're not buying things piecemeal at that point. You're spending an extra $100 and something to get the kit as opposed to just the thing itself, but it allows you room to grow, and I think that's really important. You may have heard very briefly about guiding. Guiding is a way to increase the accuracy of your tracker, particularly for heavier setups. This is something done regularly on big telescope setups, to have a guider. They're relatively small, and relatively inexpensive. It just is a little scope like this that comes with a little camera, and you plug that camera in directly to the tracker, and you do need to have a computer monitoring the guider. What it does is it monitors a single star, and as the tracker, if the tracker is not very accurate, that star will move. The guider monitors the movement of that star and sends corrections to the tracker to increase the accuracy of the tracker. Now, it's a great thing to have. However, for both guides and for astro cameras, you need a computer to control them. These astro cameras, there's just power and input controls. There's no dials. There's no way to control exposure length or to see the image or anything. You have to have a computer to control one of those cameras and to control a guider as well. So if you add those things into your setup, you need to think about how you're going to control them. One of the nice things is that you don't necessarily need a laptop. There are these little mini computers now that you can put right onto your camera, essentially. They're super lightweight. They send a signal, Wi-Fi signal, out to your phone, and you can control everything through your phone. So you don't have to be sitting out there with a laptop, which is really quite nice. And finally, the last thing in terms of astrophotography that I wanted to mention is that if you do have computer guiders or these powered cameras, you need to think about power for all that stuff. All this stuff, the trackers and everything else, requires power. Some of them are battery powered, some are AC powered. So those are things that you really need to think through. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that will conclude the astrophotography specific portion of things. I just wanted to mention really briefly and quickly, for anyone who might be interested, if you are familiar with Unique Photo in Philadelphia, they also have a big store in New Jersey. I work with Unique to run photo tours for them, but we are specifically doing one around the night sky in March of 2024 to do the Northern Lights in northern Norway, Lofoten Islands. It's a mixed day and night program, about 8 days. I just wanted to quickly go through a couple images here to show you some of the stuff that we capture there. So if you're interested in night sky, particularly aurora photography and some really, really stunningly beautiful landscape images, we invite you to join us. There's some information right here that you can look, both my website, my Instagram, and the Norway site there through Unique Photo. It's an exclusive departure for them. You have my email there as well. And with that, I want to thank everybody for sticking with me. I know we dug in deep on some things here, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a little bit, and I hope that some of you are inspired to dig into some of this this burgeoning sort of niche in photography that really has come a long, long way in the last 5 years. So thank you so much for your attention. Happy to take any questions.
I just want to thank you. It's amazing to just get an understanding of what we look at when we look at your work. Wow.
Thank you.
Wow. Wow. But to understand it, to just think, oh, he just goes out and goes snap and he gets these incredible. No way. No way. I can't begin to thank you enough for sharing your information. You are one of the most fantastic teachers that I have ever come upon, ever.
Thank you.
Um,
That's very kind of you to say. I appreciate it.
the other experience I had with stacking
Mm-hmm.
was with the head of the photography department at Wistar, and
Okay.
he talked about stacking the microscope images.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that stacking compared to your stacking, whoa, forget it, forget it. They should not both be called stacking. They're not related. So I really, really, I can't begin to thank you enough. The program is recorded. I'm hoping that the people that could not make it tonight will be able to share it on YouTube. And really, I just can't begin. It's wonderful.
Well,
It's
thank you.
just amazing. And to go to your website now, especially, and look at your work and have such a deep appreciation for what's involved in coming up with yeah,
I
I told you I'm a chatty Cathy. But oh my gosh, I am super super thankful and super impressed. So thank you. I'm gonna let other people ask you questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eileen. I really appreciate that. Yeah, please, happy for any questions. If something came in through the chat or someone wants to shout things out, by all means.
They're stunned.
Yes, there's
Well,
one.
yeah. Well, first of all, thanks. That was great. That was a wonderful overview.
Thank you.
That was so much information too. My question is the camera's battery life a concern?
Yeah, great question. If you're shooting with sort of stock Canons or what have you, Nikons, your normal sort of things. The old DSLRs I have found, I just switched 2 years ago from a 5D Mark III Canon to the R5, R6 series. And the mirrorless, they eat through batteries really quickly. And you're generally also dealing with colder temperatures as well, particularly if you're shooting out in winter. So you have a couple options there. There are, I'll see if I can pull one out easily and quickly. No, there are dummy batteries that you can get that slip into your camera and you plug them into an AC power source. So that's one way of doing it. The other way, of course, is just having to go out and change battery every. Normally for me, the mirrorless will last about 2 hours, that I can shoot consistently for about 2 hours and then it's done. The old DSLRs, I used to shoot pretty much all night on one. I could shoot 6, 7 hours on one and it would go through it. But the mirrorless, that's not the case. Any of these cameras that you're shooting with specialized cameras, these have to be powered anyway. So these are coming from DC or AC power sources. Yeah. And of course, the colder it is, the quicker the battery is going to go.
So I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned a couple of times that you shoot, sometimes it takes like 3 nights to do it or 4 nights.
Yeah.
How do you make sure your tripod is in the same place? Like, it doesn't have to be exactly the same place each time, or it just
No.
has to be, or is it because it's far enough away, as long as you have Polaris lined up, you're okay?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's exactly right. Yeah, so you basically answered the question that it depends a little bit. So when I'm shooting with, if I'm shooting sort of just with a tripod and a star tracker, pretty basic stuff, it doesn't matter where I am, as long as I'm pointed. I can set the tripod up in different locations as long as I'm pointed at the same part of the sky, and my tracker is appropriately and properly aligned. It will continue to just gather the same photos night after night. Um, Oftentimes when you're talking about with the more advanced setups, right? So with a tracker, in some ways, shooting with a tracker at basic levels is actually more difficult than some of the advanced stuff, because with the advanced stuff, even with my at-home one that I'm shooting here, it's a computerized mount. So all I have to do is align the mount, and then I tell it by computer, go to these coordinates, and it just slews the camera over to those coordinates. It doesn't matter where I am in the world, as long as those coordinates are visible, it will go there, and then it will start tracking that object. So the short answer is that yes, essentially these things are so far away that where you set up your tripod doesn't matter. I could shoot from different locations. I could shoot from one side of the country to the other, as long as I'm at the same general latitude, have the same visible objects in the sky. I can stack all that information together and it will work just fine.
So you want to keep the latitude the same?
More or less, but I mean, the only, I could change 10 degrees or so without too much of a problem. I mean, the issue is that of course the sky changes. So if I was to fly down to the equator, the things that I'm going to see 70 degrees up in the sky above me here are going to be very different and may not be visible at the equator. So that's where you want to keep the same general latitude. Longitude doesn't matter, but latitude is where the sky is going to change. Yes.
One more quick question. So it seems like it sounds like once you've set everything up, I mean, this is a largely automated thing happening,
Yeah.
so just curious what you're doing in all that time.
um well, no, so if I have a bigger setup out that has a computerized motorized mount, where I can literally set it and I can have the computer shoot multiple targets, right? So in a night, I can tell it to shoot something for 2 hours, then slew somewhere else and shoot another thing for 3 hours, and then shoot a third thing as these things are moving into better and worse positions. I can quite literally go to sleep. I can set it up. I can go to sleep throughout the night. It will shoot throughout the night, shut itself down in the morning. I have to then come out and break everything down, collect the data off of whether it's the computer or from a memory card or what have you, and then I start my processing. If it is something like a star tracker, generally I'm staying up for that. So once it is set up, I'll come back periodically to check battery, to check that it is tracking accurately, to check that the photos, I don't want to waste 3 hours on something. So I'll come back and I'll check it periodically. There are also some star trackers that require you to sort of reset them every hour and a half. Which is a bit of a pain, but for me, it's worth it. I can stay up most of the night, or sleep for an hour or so, come back, reset things, and then go back. So it is largely an automated process once you have everything set up. And then, of course, comes the processing, which is a whole nother beast unto itself. But if you're doing it right, hopefully you're having a drink or getting some sleep while the camera's doing all the work. So. Anything else? Was there anything that came through in the chat, Adam?
No.
No, I didn't see anything.
No, okay. There were no chats.
Great.
I think it takes a while for this type of information to begin to sink in a little bit. Sure. I think that's, I'm just going to wish everyone very pleasant dreams tonight. And just thank everyone who took the time to learn something. Yes, and there was a chat that just came through from Adkin, who said, very interesting, very interesting.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for the invitation to be able to speak. And again, we'll Eileen, I think we can follow up with some of the slideshow stuff. Is that right? So I can send out some information for those who may be interested.
Yes. If you send it to me, then I will take care of forwarding it. And just really thank you. We have a November Zoom coming up, which is going to be Portraits Without Borders from Mike Browna. And also our October show at the Plastic Club will open October 1st. And so the Photo Society, 161 years, and we are going strong because of people like you that share your information and make photography continue to be not even a subject, but a purpose,